Hi everyone. With me today is the great Tyler Mowery, who has an amazing YouTube channel. He has about 250,000 subscribers. One of the key topics he mentions that I find hard to find almost anywhere else is philosophical conflict. How are you doing today, Tyler?
I'm doing great, Declan. How are you?
Well, I'm good. I feel very lucky we could align a time pretty well. It's always quite hard when it's Australia and North America, more so on the
Yeah.
East Coast. I know you're on the West Coast, so that certainly made it a little bit easier. But yeah, I will also add though, Tyler does also run practical screenwriting course for those passionate. If you head over to his YouTube channel, you'll find it. How is that going at the moment, Tyler?
Very well. It's interesting you mention it. I'm working on doing a pretty big rebuild of it. That's one of my big goals for this year is to do I've learned a lot over the last, I guess, 3, 4 years since I've updated the course. And so now I'm going back in and doing a big overhaul.
Oh, marvelous, man. All right. So, firstly, the big question: what is philosophical conflict? It's a very
It's a
broad
conflict
question, I
of
know.
beliefs.
Conflict of beliefs. Okay. So, yes, I do want to get into that. So, yeah. So,
Yeah, so it's a conflict of beliefs. Essentially, what's happening is you have like what really is pushing a story forward is that different people, different characters in that story have different ways of viewing the world. They have different worldviews that are coming into conflict in the story, right? And so it is the most, I guess, abstract layer of conflict, and it's also the most important one because all of the other layers sit on top of it and use it as their fuel, right? So every movie or every story has like a concept, right? We're in a certain world in a certain place, whether that's modern times or it's some sort of higher concept or it's period piece set in the past. But then the characters and what is happening to them and the choices that they're making, ultimately they come to philosophical choices, those choices being physical and philosophical. For example, if you were going to make a romantic film, the fundamental choice in the story is should I be with this person or not, right? That is the fundamental choice of pretty much any romance story. And then there's all these whys and who is that person? What qualities do they embody? And is this someone that this other character will be with or should be with, or all of these different things? So, really, because I think um, the what is most meaningful to people is what we believe. It affects our lives. It affects how we interact with other people. It affects the entire world around us is built by what we believe about it, right? We project our beliefs into the world, and the world gives us what we believe back. And so, really, then it's all disguised in emotional conflict and physical conflict, right? And so then those become the layers with which we go through philosophical conflicts. Hopefully that makes sense.
absolutely, it does. Like, that's one of the things I want to say. Like, I said, one of those things I've read a lot of books on screening, like Robert McKee, Sid Field. And not to say they don't cover exactly those words you've used. Like, there is things like about like, usually what they'll say is something like there may be an antagonist, right? But they're not usually an antagonist in their own eyes if it's a good one. I will say where I think there could be maybe an exception there. I think horror films, it's a bit different, obviously, in the case of Jaws, right? Obviously, the shark, it's a shark. You don't really want to worry about that. But I will say that brings me to a question about like, because something I think I've seen a lot of your videos is, I may be wrong exactly. It's been a while since I've watched some of those, but is like, so you're not wrong or anything, but it's like the antagonist's got to have the perfect bounce off the protagonist, technically speaking, like in terms of a character belief. Am I right?
It can work that way.
Right.
Um, like a lot of this depends, right? Like there's a million. I think what's weird about story is there's a lot of like so much stuff is story, right? The story is the fundamental language with which we communicate, right? We communicate through stories because stories hold beliefs. So if we want to express something to someone about why we're doing what we're doing, we're going to tell them a story. Because of that, there is such a wide definition as to what a story is that you have to be specific as to what kind of story you're talking about. to actually say, okay, does it always have to be this way? Does it always have to be that way? These sorts of things, which is why I like talking about story within the confines of like feature filmmaking or TV, because it gives you a certain, like it gives you fence post, right? It needs to work a certain way because of the medium. And now we can have a more intelligent conversation as to how that would work. So to answer your question, if I was going to tell a story through the medium of audio visual storytelling, usually like 2 hours long, it's very, very like it's very good to have two characters, one each, that is the full, highest, most powerful embodiment of the two sides of the philosophical conflict that you're looking at in that story. So, and to another way to say philosophical conflict, it's a big old mouthful. Think of it like yin and yang, right? I'm sure you've seen the yin and yang symbol.
Countless
That is,
times.
that's how it works, right? Like I very much believe we exist in duality at all times, right? There is light and dark, there is good and bad, there is order, there is chaos, and we exist always in the in between these sort of dualities that exist over and over and over and over and over again. And so that is and so then from a belief standpoint or from a worldview standpoint, if one is to have a certain belief, right, then by nature of that belief's existence, there must be the negative or opposite belief to that belief, right? And so now that's ultimately, I think, what a story is able to explore is like, okay, you can have a world, whether that's one character or 1,000 characters, that represents belief one, or the truth or the lie, right? Truth and lie is a really good way to think about this because that is the nature of beliefs. So you have the lie on one side, and that can be one character or 1,000, and then you have truth on the other side, and that can be embodied by one character or as many as you want. And so, and then those characters then become the actors of the dilemma at hand, right? Of the two sides of the conflict that we're seeing. And so it's really just a way to think about how is your story's conflict more meaningful than this army is fighting this army, or this guy is angry at this guy for something super petty, right? It allows your stories to really be about something in a way that makes them powerful.
I've got you there, right. Brings me to a question. So I am one where I used to always have this thing where I used to know a guy who was a TV director. He would always, when I tell him I'm working on a script at the moment, he would always say to me, before he even asked, what's this story about? Which is like 99% of people I know. His question was, what does your lead character want? Do they want revenge? What are they going to climb Mount Everest for? I mean, he did bring up stuff about conflict and all, but that was the first question. So it sounds like what you're thinking. I think this comes before want, I will say, philosophical conflict. Um,
Well, that's interesting you say that because this is real. This is where you get into some questions, and some of this stuff I'm not even fully sure myself on. But like, there's a nature of, I don't know how to say this. Some of my views on story are now starting to collide with what I believe in real life, and which is very, very interesting. And trying to figure out like exactly how this is working. And the reason I say this is, if your character has a want, that want, yes, is coming out of a belief that they have, right? And
yeah.
so usually, yes, your philosophical conflict and or your character's beliefs are going to then create their want, create their desire. And if you go into like sort of a Buddhist philosophical view, where you might hear like all desire is our belief that we don't have what we need, right? Like we separate ourselves from the thing that we think is going to fulfill us. And that is usually how you create a character's lie and a character's arc, in the sense that a character wants something usually because they have a belief about that physical object and how it's going to change their life or help them or make them a better person. And then they go out and find that thing and realize it's not fulfilling, and realize they were whole all along. They were creating unwholeness through their beliefs, right? And so you almost have that. That's where you get this strange thing in stories where your characters arc at the end, but it always feels non-physical, right? Where it's like, okay, the character arc, but what does that really mean? How are we feeling that? A lot of times it's because it's a character's realization of, I didn't need this thing I was chasing, and that I can be whole without it. And then I can make the right choice to solve the big conflict, realizing that I was whole the entire time, or that I didn't need this exterior thing to satisfy me. So because of that, yes, I do think character want comes out of what the character believes. Absolutely.
Yes, that is a good point there. I mean, it does. One theory he had, this wasn't, there's just someone, like I said, who I knew who was worked in TV, film. He did mention, I think at one point, we had a bit of like, I'm going to say debates. It's where I would try and think, because this was about when I was very young, like just out of film school. I would say, always a character want, not true. What about Catcher in the Rye? What about this film, that film, that film? And usually they were certainly not big Hollywood films. They would be something like, I'm going to say, Coffee and Cigarettes, Jim Jarmusch, where it's not to say they don't want anything or Night on Earth, it's just that they don't want anything that's of such a high stake, like a Richard Linklater film, I want to say, Boyhood, which, what I'm going to say, if you ask me, in terms of this now 10 years on, if I think about philosophical conflict in terms of Boyhood, assuming you've seen it, or ones that came to you recently as some slasher movies like, I'll tell you where I'll get at, where I see it when I hear this stuff. If you just said to me this and didn't show me a video like that, instantly I try and go back to Shakespeare. We think of, okay, Hamlet, revenge. I believe this man should be killed because he killed my father. He should not be the king. Uncle, on the other hand, I should be the king because I'm the man. I know how to rule the town. So I think what you've said, I think you can see where that line's almost perfectly 100% A, side B from what you've just described. In the case of quite a few horror films where the villain potentially does not have a motive, such as Halloween, Psycho. They're just mentally crazy, stab, 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 stab. Would you exactly call that an protagonist antagonistic philosophical conflict?
Well, I think I think a lot of the themes just end up being about, like, are you going to be fearful of the monster or not?
Right.
Right? Like, do you fear the monster, or do you not fear the monster, and that gives you strength in some way, right? Where you have some stories where the monster can't touch you because you're not afraid of it. And then, different things like that. With horror, I think what's interesting about horror is we very, very rarely encounter beings that are like fully demonic in that way, right? That are just absolutely, total killers without any sort of feeling or remorse. That's I don't know how, like, it's very much a Hollywood creation more
It
than it's
is.
true to life in many ways.
That is
Uh,
true. If I were to try and defend that, try and being on your side here, I'm not trying to do it and then jump on the opposite side, but I thought I should raise that point because, like, I know a lot of young writers ask, hang on, if this is about that, what is it in this film? And I think you are going to find a few films that don't quite have philosophical conflict that are not particularly very good for that reason. Like, I
sure.
do think when I bring up the reason I bring up Slasher is I was questioning that about what about those films where they don't have a motive, like I said, Psycho, Halloween. If I were to argue not on your side in terms of the yes, a philosophical conflict though, in the case of Halloween, have you seen Halloween?
I actually haven't.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, Psycho.
I have seen Psycho,
Oh,
yes.
okay. Well, I mean, I could have used the first one, but just for the point, I just didn't want to spoil overly, or if anyone watching, and I'm sure people should maybe see Psychoverse. So I would argue in that case, I just don't think the philosophical conflict is really in Norman Bateson society. It's more about the whole first the woman who steals the briefcase, and then it's about
Mhm.
where she's running from, and then the sister, and like we've got to get this, and then she's just on holidays, whatever. It's more about really. It doesn't have to exactly be in the protagonist. I mean, come on, she's killed off a third of the way into the movie and the antagonist, but it
Mhm.
does, I would argue, have to be somewhere at least within the broad spectrum of the story. Would you agree?
Well, ultimately, it's just, if your story is meaningful, there is a conflict of beliefs in there somewhere, right? And also, your story is going to have even small, like, philosophical conflict can be super, super small as well, in the sense that you can have let's say you have two boys that are thinking about climbing a tree, right? And we have a scene. Two boys want to climb a tree, or one of them wants to climb the tree, the other one doesn't want to, right? So now we have this debate about a choice, which is what all scenes are. Dialogue is a debate about a choice. And so now they're having this discussion. No, we should climb the tree. No, I don't want to. One of them chooses to go climb the tree. And now he's, making fun of the other boy who decided not to from who's still standing on the ground. That's still a conflict of beliefs, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a external conflict. Do I want to climb the tree or not? It's like, do I conquer my fear, right? Do I live in fear or do I not live in fear, right? Like, so your story and many stories innately have a sense of a conflict of beliefs between characters, as is natural. The question becomes how interwoven, how clear, and how meaningful, and how largely important or small do you want that theme that you are expressing through your philosophical conflict to be? So I think it's less of a question of does it always exist or not? I have read a lot of poor screenplays, a lot of them. And I've also worked with a lot of writers one-on-one to fix their screenplays. And what I've noticed when I've worked with writers is that many of them may not be able to articulate exactly what it is they're trying to say, but most people have a general idea. And if you read their first draft or wherever they are, you can get a sense of what it is they're talking about if you're being attentive and if you're really looking at what you have in front of you and thinking about what is not only just this screenplay, but this is a person's 110-page story that they decided to write. They could have written anything. Well, not really. They could not have written anything. This is really the story they could write. And then what about them, about their beliefs, about their worldview is coming through on the page, even if it's a first draft, because it's always there. It just may not be fully clear. It may not be fully polished, but it is there.
Yes. Now, I'm glad you say that because it brings me to the next question I want to ask about is I have heard it talked about more on like other channels like Thomas Flight, or I believe Lessons from the Screen Flu. Haven't used those words, but they have talked about like, I think, as you know, you refer to this a lot on your channel, the Joker and Batman, why they're just perfect with almost the exact opposite sides of the character beliefs, would you say? Am I right? Or have I made a mistake on your channel?
Yeah.
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 Because is it a thing that lacks in those drafts?
There is tons lacking in the drafts. And there's a lot that's lacking that people don't even consider is lacking. If you look at a film like The Dark Knight that you bring up, and you actually sat down and really watched what's happening in it and really understood everything that's going on at the same time, the movie is wildly complex, right? It is extremely complex. There's so many details and everything is fully meaningful and interwoven. There are not lots of useless little pieces in these kinds of things. These movies, especially big blockbuster, professionally done Hollywood films, they are extremely intricate on a level that 98% of viewers are not seeing. And so a lot of working on a script, I can list some of the things if you'd like of like what's missing, and maybe I will in a second. But a lot of what's it's a lot of what, and I find this a lot when I am like potentially considering to work with somebody one-on-one on their screenplay. It's like, do they have an understanding that what they have right now, it's not a 6. Most people really think they write a first draft. They're like, this is a 5, this is a 4, this is a 6, right? They're like, I'm in the middle of the pack here on this first draft, but you only think you're in the middle of the pack because your skill level is so low. And that sounds how it sounds, but it's the truth. Very likely you have a 3, you have a 2, like you have something that is very, very bare bones, and it requires a lot of work to actually bring it to something that is of extremely high quality. And I think that's also why you see writing, especially Hollywood screenwriting, like it has deteriorated, I would argue, over the last, really since 2008. Okay. And I think a lot of, and there is a level of intentionality and attention required to write something very, very good that is not happening as much. But to give you some answers on what you were saying in regards to what's missing. A lot of the times it's not like this thing is totally and completely missing. What you have a lot of the time is a lot of stuff that's 25% of the way done, right? We have 25% of a philosophical conflict. We've got half a character web, right? We've got 4 characters. We need like 9 or 10 for this story or something like this. We've got maybe an act 1 that's working and a good idea for a climax, but not much of an act 2. So we've got some structure, but not totally. We've got certain moments where the pacing is working, and then we've got flashbacks and other crap in other places. We have a few scenes where choices are clear. Then we have scenes where we have no idea what the choice is, no idea what's being debated here. And so what you end up with is a lot of things that are halfway done. And that's been a big thing for me of trying to break down very clearly where problems are and what needs to happen to fix them, because it's never light switches, right? I'm never coming in and like on-offing, being like, okay, you have characters, you have structure, you need concept and philosophical. It's like, it's always like sliding scales. Everybody has a piece of these different things, and we say, okay, you have the start here. Let's bring this out and let's really bring this into something that becomes a fully fleshed idea, because a first draft so many times is a lot of 20% fleshed out ideas, and some of them can be good. You just haven't fully and completely got so deeply into the weeds of that idea. You might have a character, but you haven't figured out all these other little details that are so important, that give so much polish to what you see from some of the huge, well-written films.
Absolutely. If I can relate to a lot of what you just said there, going back a while myself, right, as when I was starting out screenwriting and stuff, is having made a few short films, which is a bit different, of course. I mean, not to say I didn't have that stuff, but I remember writing a script where, following actually on from that lessons from the screenplay video about Dark Knight, say it used the example of why the Joker is the perfect villain. I know this is not about philosophical conflict, but it is about like characters and beliefs and stuff, is it mentions in there what makes him a great villain is attacking the protagonist's weakness, and going against that is the strong thing. It's not as opposed to, like, I think it kind of down talked Superman, where it's always like, I find a lot of 80s action movies have this, where it's like, it's not really this guy at the same power level. It's more a Schwarzenegger character taking on 100 people, and the weakness is really only because it's so many people. I want to say Die Hard, I think, is the film to change that, in my opinion. And that's why since then, why a lot of Stallone and Schwarzenegger films flopped in the 90s, and people were more after Keanu Reeves, Bruce Willis, not because of the stars alone, but that type of protagonist. And which if you ask me, I say for the better, as in I think that's a lot more philosophical believing, despite them, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed some of those Schwarzenegger films from the 80s, but where I bring up is what I could relate is, as I learned about that, I remember writing a script thinking, look, whenever we watch a video, read a book, there's only so much we can remember. And it's usually the headlines. Like, I know a lot of young writers remember show, not tell, one of the first things we learn. And they'll walk away saying, well, my dialogue is exactly that. Sometimes when thinking younger, maybe don't even have a word, and you've hit that mark, but not exactly true. And when you got to find what the true meaning of it is, I think Robert McKee really brought me that to a whole nother level, learning about subtext. What I can relate, I remember doing when you say that is, when I was about 25 writing my first script, I was like in the whole, I'll throw these books, just do it, and I'll feel the structure as I'm doing it. Yes, I thought there was structure, but it was very just, okay, a guy goes to a town and they're all really racist. And look, it's easy to just add a theme to it, add a character belief, but what it didn't have was, it was just learning as I said, it was like about a guy who, well, wants to set up a karate joint, so he certainly knows how to fight. We've got an action movie there, but it's in a Texas where, and this is going by the stereotypes, not always true, but guns and whatnot, and this guy, anti-guns as you can get. And it's really just easy to have the antagonist go like that. Okay, the protagonist in a weak situation. If you asked me, telling my younger self this, I mean, if I could do that, I'd probably be saying, just make Parasite and, hey, there's your life for you. But that would be my advice for my younger self. But however, what I think I really missed there myself was, it's like I've taken the saying just way too literally. Would you say what I've gone there is like way too literally in expressing that, or philosophical belief and whatnot?
I'm not quite sure.
Oh, fair enough. It's a bit hard without the script, I guess, to say that. But yeah, fair, fair.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I did like what you're saying, like your example of the person who's anti-gun getting a gun pointed in his face. Like that is what you want in the sense of you have a yin and yang kind of conflict. In the example of Joker and Batman, you have Batman is the essentially ultra cop, right? That's kind of what he represents. He represents the ultra cop in the shadows, right? That's who Batman is. And Joker is the ultra criminal in the light, right? He says exactly what he's going to do, when he's going to do it. He walks around, he's in the light, Batman is in the shadow. And the argument is, the shadow cop needs to beat the light criminal.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point. So, as of like this, I just sort of want to close on this as I'll wrap it up and all is, do you think like just as I know you mentioned earlier, and I know yeah, someone I've known to very criticize a lot of modern day, mainly Hollywood films, in maybe the last 1 or 2 years, um, can you think of a film that you think has a very good use of philosophical conflict that just comes to mind? I'm sure there's plenty around, or maybe not, but is there anything that comes to your mind?
Something that the last couple of years, I haven't been watching as many movies that have come out recently.
Okay, fair, fair.
Um, I'm trying to think, what was the
One of my favorite films of last year was Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. The
okay.
Yeah, if you haven't seen that, it's all right. But I want to say like what I liked about the philosophical conflict being really like I was a bit like I was talking about earlier. It's actually because it's a multiverse film about within the whole universe, as in like
Mhm.
about following this exact structure of the way the Spider-Man story is meant to be, how it is of like the whole uncle and whatnot. And so I won't to spoil for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, but that was one of my favorites for of last year. But other ones
Gotcha.
I did love was Past Lives, about if you haven't seen, but that also deals with the whole thing about friendship and the importance and whatnot. So it's always anything put in there as theme, obviously. And I will admit something I've been a bit guilty of in the past. I mean, excuse me for talking a bit too much about myself here these last few minutes, but is jamming a little bit too many themes into a script. Like one point, I
Mhm.
got feedback from I think Stage 32 where the opening line was, "This script has the theme of A, B, C, D, E, F. Just one of these could be just one of these is enough for your movie." I had that
But
once.
that's such a good point though, because that is most of good storytelling is simplifying down to one very clear idea. That's the hardest thing to do, right? Like, and that's what we're not taught to do in school. People are like, we're told to write extra to fill the word count. I've always hated that. It's what it should be is you are forced to, let's say, write your big 1,000 word essay or 2,000 words or however long, and then you're told, okay, distill this entire essay down into 4 sentences that are saying the exact same thing. That to me is good writing because it is the length and all these, we can do 17 billion things, and that's what makes things complicated. But unity, focus, oneness, that is what makes things clear.
I do agree. I will admit again, I might add where I fell into that trap is like this is where I did combine a bit too many genres and stuff without giving the plot away because I'm still work on this one. That's why I may not put this up. So like I did for one earlier, but it is more about like in this case, I guess what I fell into the trap of is like say when we look at is like adding like I'll just say genres: horror, action, adventure, and
Mhm.
comedy. Others too. Like I thought of like, okay, well, what about Shrek? Does that not have a whole adventure and then it's just all falls like that? But says me, I wonder why can that use that and not me? Is I think that was very stuck really close to its theme as one of my previous videos I talk about with because it's like so close to where even though it was pretty, he gets up the tower, saves the princess, and then that alone sounds like that could be a movie, right? Just save the princess and then kiss and voila, we've got a movie alone. I mean, I guess that is kind of Lord of the Rings getting all the way up that big hill and dropping it, but well and truly, even dragged out well and truly.
More or
But
less.
every movie we can just dumb down to a sentence, and that may be
Yeah.
alone for Shrek. But I think really because of the way it stays so true and plays out, and we see the characters develop over time, is why that would be. I personally wouldn't recommend that kind of style to an amateur writer myself. Is like don't add in like a big adventure like that and then go to it. But if you can do it well, like Shrek, which is hard to
Well,
do,
Shrek is a commentary on fairy tales. It's specifically doing that, right? Like
well,
that,
fair
the
point, yeah.
purpose of of it was to be a commentary on like this story flow. And so because of that, it's now that's what where you're subverting, you know.
Yes, I agree. That was what I talked about. One of the things that was more about structure, but the previous video. And that's why it's something I think if you're going to go down that path in an amateur, make sure you go commenting on a stereotype or subverting rather than writing just a straight up original script and doing
Right.
that. You can be like me, there was a bit more to it though, but yeah, so there. Otherwise, I guess on the note of fairy tales, that brings me to the conclusion of this meeting. And but instead, though, of a happily ever after, I would like to say thank you very much for doing this, Tyler.
Thanks for having me.
No worries, man. Yeah. So, and I'm also glad we didn't spike up some philosophical conflict here very much. Thank you. Otherwise, for those who are watching, I hope you please like and subscribe and also go check out Tyler's channel. I certainly couldn't recommend it enough. I will drop a link in the comments for his practical screenwriting course.